Okay, so you've heard everyone disproving these creationists, from like the atheistic scientific perspective. But we're gonna play on their ground. We're gonna work under their framework. I'm gonna disprove some creationist claims from a Christian perspective. Gonna play on their field. So starting with this video, first, this guy somehow claims that dogs can only turn into other dogs, but that's because they're the same species. Like dogs turning into dogs is not an example of you disproving evolution. Because you're citing that, oh, it's natural selection, but not evolution. It's not really natural selection because, first of all, they're the same species. And second of all, humans bred dogs, like purposefully. Like that's artificial selection that literally is against the definition of the word natural. Okay, so his second bullshit claim. He is now claiming that each type of animal is only from its own kind because he cites Genesis, but this is bullshit for two reasons. He says it's not species because God didn't use the word species, but the Bible isn't fucking written in God's mind. It's written using the human language that's meant to express God's ideas or information. So why the fuck would God invent the word species if no one would understand what it means until someone would independently create it, like thousands of years later? That makes no fucking sense. Second of all, dude, you're probably using an English Bible since you're Protestant, so you aren't reading the original Hebrew, and especially not the original Greek that was translated from Hebrew to Greek back to Hebrew, or even the original Latin. So get that shit out of here. And then he's like, oh, it's blah, blah, blah. Each organism starts on its own fucking thing, like its own independent, unique origin. The problem with that is, either way, everything would have to have an origin within God. Because if it didn't have an origin within God, then it would be separate from God. But by that definition, if it doesn't come from God, it has to have its own origin that God and that thing share in common. Thus, God would not be God, but then you just have God anyway. So, like, everything in creation has to have some origin, regardless where they all bring into, with the only exception being God, who is by his definition eternal. So you can't have unique origins for everything. Okay. Also, think about it. If that was true, then that means like either A, dinosaurs and sheep would have to exist at the same time, and then dinosaurs go extinct, or B, God just Thanos snap whatever species he wants to into existence. Which, like, we've seen new species show up. So he's not doing that. What was it? Oh, so he says that horses have chunks of DNA that bacteria don't. So you can't breed a horse into a bacteria, but then he later says that you can remove information, so you can de-evolve in a sense, which means by your own logic you could breed a horse into bacteria. That's contradicting yourself. Then he also says that you can't gain information, but bacteria can gain information through natural selection. This happens tons of times. He cites a later example of antibiotic resistance, but there's tons of examples of bacteria that have specifically evolved specific type of cell walls in order to counteract antibiotics. So they are gaining information, which you can do. What was it? Like, natural selection helps you add information because you can't have new traits like long hair that he cites with the fucking dogs, that extra information. And then he says natural selection is a creationist view, not an evolutionary view, but like it's very clearly evolutionary since it is to change, and natural selection changes a creature by definition. What else does he say? But then he brings up dog breeding again, except that's artificial selection again, and dogs are part of the same species. And then he brings up fucking like two dogs or whatever, and he's like, oh, two dogs became poodles. They became wolves. But the problem is that if you only have two dogs, you would have genetic bottlenecking, which we have seen in genetics, and thus you'd have just a bunch of fucking dogs with autism and Down syndrome running around, which most aren't. But then he also cites that animals can only get less complex, implying that the two dogs that he made, that Noah brought, would be the most genetically complex. And he cites poodles as less complex than wolves as an example. But like, poodles have 2.8 billion base pairs of DNA, while wolves, coyotes, and jackals have 2.5 billion base pairs. Which means the DNA within a poodle is greater than the DNA within a fucking wolf, which completely contradicts what you said. As well, a fucking potato has more DNA in it than a human genome. So either A, on the hierarchy of being, potatoes exceed that of humans, or that you're just wrong. Let's see what else is there. But he also says like mutations can only remove, but then he says adding in mistakes for changes. But when you add in a mistake, you aren't removing something, you're adding something. Otherwise, poodles wouldn't have fucking more shit. But then with this whole like reverse thing, you could breed a horse to be a super simple horse, but you can't breed a simple horse to be a complex horse, which means you can't add traits. Like that's retarded. So this guy makes this claim about like H. pylori lost a thing, which ended up preventing it from like interacting with this enzyme. But the problem is, what was it? He is right that that is what happened, but not really, because it lost an ability. But it lost that ability because it changed the enzyme's inhibitor, which was an addition of two different genes replacing two other genes. So a new trait was gained with no information being lost. So he lost an ability, but no information was lost. And besides, like there are examples in humans of genetic information being added, like Huntington's disease, which is caused by an insertion or an addition of another gene. And then he cites Dr. Lee, whatever, for saying no extra gene was ever added. But this guy is a scholar from Israel or whatever, and he specifically cites his religious views for his purpose of thinking this, and then has been discredited multiple times by the rest of the scientific community. So that's a unvalid or invalid and completely biased and prejudiced source. Like I could bring up 100 sources that cite the exact opposite. But no, here's the next thing. It goes to conservation of energy with information theory. And he says information cannot be produced by nature, and then he jumps to because of that, information has to be produced by a mind. But that has nothing to do with evolution, because nothing prevents God from creating the system of laws, like the laws of nature, that currently can generate life, rather than him just snapping into existence. So this is like, there's literally an example of a nuclear reactor called the Oklo deposit, which existed in nature, that occurred because of like the delicate balance of natural laws and a lot of fucking time and chance. So to claim evolution didn't occur because God is the source of creation is you would imply that God literally purposely built a fucking nuclear reactor for no reason or for some reason. But like God didn't was like, you know what? Humans are still fucking walking around the highlands of Africa. I'm gonna put a fucking nuclear bomb in the middle of Africa. Yeah, that's gonna work. And then he brings up his origin of articles example of like, hey, I just posted the article. How do you know someone wrote it? Like, isn't that like evolution? First of all, we have observed evolution occurring. So it's not just like we're looking into the past, like this is a current thing. And second of all, articles don't have a mechanism in order to change. Like they're static. There is no fucking natural selection for writing. Like no, like it's not like course articles are just naturally gonna get weeded out, and ones that make more sense are gonna be brought to the topic of some like interchain or whatever. You wrote this in advance because there's no system that can cause it. But natural selection, which you admitted can cause change, is the system that causes evolution. So that's like the first part of this, but there's just so much fucking wrong with this. Like from the Christian perspective, it completely contradicts like theism, monotheism, the origin of creation, and a bunch of other things. Like it's pretty obvious.